just to say, I'm trying to bring these three fascinating and rather different stories together to work out where the connections might lie. And it seems to me that they all began confronting stories of lack and imbalance and ways possibly trying to address those. Chris talked about the historic collection not reflecting his demographic. Sue talked about ongoing attempts at Tate over 20 years to move from what was essentially quite a limited Western-centric collection to embrace a fully global remit. And Hilke was talking about maybe a more complicated story of somehow trying to confront a history of very particular selection and acquisition in the face of new and in some ways maybe competing demands of the demographic of your local audience. So far so similar, and it was interesting that both Chris and Hilke, one of your own volition and one maybe slightly prompted, sought in a way to look historically, retrospectively, you at your exhibition of 1939 and you at the various manifestations of art in the GDR. At that point, it seems maybe the stories diverge rather, and where you might go, what you might do with that, it differs because of the, well, I guess the changing demands of your audiences, but also the ways in which the historical realities somehow relate to art history and how art history might or might not respond to them. Does that, I mean, would you all recognize some sort of commonalities there? Do you see aspects of each other's stories that strike you as relevant to you? Do you want to begin, Chris? You haven't talked for ages.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I do think that the phrase that we use, staff and board of trustees, most at the museum is relevance. So how do we achieve relevance in the present relative to the audience that we have not quite yet captured? And I think in order to engage the interest of that audience, we have to demonstrate our relevance to the stories and questions that structure day-to-day life. And so whereas for me, I think there is a kind of, and I use this phrase advisedly, sort of ruthless emphasis on arts of the diaspora and Black American artists. I would say that sort of the meta commitment, which I think coursed through all of the presentations, is the promise of a relationship between art and society. The fact that through a picture, through a sculpture, through a moving image, you actually can talk about the conditions that we all share. And I'll say that in Baltimore in particular, race relations it's such a difficult subject to talk about head on. And we as a city have confronted so many problems. They occur and reoccur in different manifestations, year to year, month to month, week to week. And so, there was for instance, there was an article on the front cover of the New York Times recently, which was about the failed city of Baltimore as the murder capital of the United States, which it is by the statistics. I would also say that one consequence of the blight, as people put it, is having one of the most incredible Black creative corps that our country has ever seen. No, not my country, that country has ever seen. And so there are sort of two sides to the story, and I think one of the roles that the museum can play is connecting those two narratives. So a city that is suffering considerably, and then a creative class that is emerging to answer that condition. One is in part a consequence of the other, and I think it's our job to become the convener for that discussion, bringing everybody as close as possible.
I imagine, Hilke, that you would agree with that, and that's what you tried to do, but in your case it plays somewhat differently, I would say, because of the response of your audience.
Yes, so what was really important for me my whole career is to think about how to democratize the work in a museum. And I think it's very much, in your work, it's very much about that too. So right now I'm a bit frustrated, and I spoke to Boris Greuß the other day about this because he came for a lecture, that I now have the feeling, and this is really frustrating, that it's not possible. So not in a situation that is politically so difficult like right now in Eastern Germany, and I think And that's what Boris Royce told me, that the universities and the museums, we have to try to stay free from populism, and so this is the thing that right on moves me a lot. But I think so I think my situation is quite special, and you can't compare it too much.
You talked about the reverberation of history, but also about the existence of two art histories.
Yes.
So which complicates the position for you in a way. But I suppose we're talking about the extent, I think, to which art history is truly reflecting, or can more truly reflect, the historical realities, the lived social lived realities, lived experience. Would you agree? How does this play for you, Sue?
Yeah, I think it's art historical questions are very important for curators, but also when we think about the audience who don't necessarily have that knowledge or don't need to have that knowledge, but still appreciating art in the context of social sort of environment and also as a sort of a cultural environment. And I think especially now, in the era where we see this rising sensibility of nationalism and even a bit of a sort of this, perhaps what can be called as like imaginaries of empire sort of coming back, is quite a scary sort of time to think about the audience as a sort of more of a accessible, but not in a populist or sort of in a programmatic way of engaging them. So it's important to think historically, and especially art historically for curators, but I would probably challenge ourselves to think more about what it really means to engage diverse audience in a society where these diversities are kind of decreasing.
Does anyone want to follow that?
Yes, I just want to reaffirm that and say that I think it's important sometimes to acknowledge that our historical delivery mechanisms for content are really deficient relative to the present moment. So a really good example of that was a series of texts and emails I received on the course of this trip. So there's a TV show in the US called 60 Minutes, which is very broadly watched, and Anderson Cooper is the big star of that. And the subject of the most recent 60 Minutes was Mark Bradford. So this is extremely unusual for a fine artist to occupy that seat. And the deluge of response I received to that I thought was really instructive relative to, you know, other and more sort of native moments of press attention that the museum gets. So a laudatory review in the New York Times, or, you know, a nice piece in Art Forum, or, you know, the accolades of your trustees. But it's actually that moment where sophisticated advanced ideas traffic in the mainstream that becomes, to me, really, really interesting. So not populism, not at all, but popular interest in advanced concepts.
Interesting. But of course, I mean, if we are talking about art history as inherently progressive, you've also been talking about a perceived desire or need in your audience to access memory, which is in some ways a regressive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because now looking backwards, the whole debate was a kind of proxy debate. So it's about all the things that after the peaceful revolution were torn down. Yeah. So it's not only about the arts, but about the important buildings, architecture. Everything changed for Eastern German people. So while the Western Germans discussed after '89 what to do now with the postal codes, that was the most complicated question, the Eastern Germans had to deal with their whole life changing. And so many people lost their jobs. Everything changed. So I think this is a problem in my case, but what is a good thing about the working in East Germany is that people have a quite close relationship to the arts. So it was really essential for them in GDR times. It was not just for pleasure, but it was essential for everyday life, to go to the theater, to classical music, of course, and arts. And it was really touching to see my public in the show I had about these East German painting and sculpture, that they really understood certain codes that were in the paintings. And it was a way to have free speech via this painting. paintings. So this was really interesting and touching to see for me as a West German.
Interesting. What sort of codes? I mean, how would you characterize?
Yeah, as you see, you saw some paintings by Matoya, for example. Of course, at first sight they are social realistic and official paintings, but then you see it's about Sisyphus, and you can read them as a critique of the system too. So this ambivalence is present in many, many, many pieces. And even if people, it's really difficult to divide between official and non-official artists in the GDR, and even the artists who have been in prison for their works, they do not want this separation anymore, because they said, of course, the state was present in the arts in East Germany, but in the Western arts it was a market. So we were both not free.
The market. How does the market play in relation to your ongoing strategies? Is it on your side or is it an obstacle? I know it's a big question, but I'm just have a go. Anyone? Or indeed, are you absolutely implicated in it?
Yeah, please. Okay. Well, yeah, that's always a bit of a conundrum, and I know Martin knows very well, so very well questioned. But I would say, especially to look at sort of global trajectories of different types of art from across the world, we have sort of encountered a lot of problems with the market. When we were slightly ahead, it was all fine. But as soon as we entered, the market has responded quite actively. So, I mean, our presence becomes more of a problem itself, and sort of our peer museums who are also looking at sort of global art histories and more transnational sort of stories about art, modern and contemporary. So in places like Asia, Middle East, Russia, Africa, Latin America, everything has sort of changed in terms of market because of these museums collecting activities. So it's sometimes about the matter of timing, but also how you negotiate with the artists and their estates and galleries. And Tate's sort of advantage was always about this non-deaccessioning institution. So they know that the collection will stay in the collection, and that becomes quite a powerful commitment from our side, so that we can always reinterpret the art history slightly differently. And I'm sure in generations after my peers, there will be different things, and they will question, why did this curator acquire this specific work, like I am doing now with a lot of previous works. So again, it's not something you can really be against or be part of, but you have to be very aware and then trying to navigate it with ethical and more sort of a committed kind of attitude as well.
What's your view?
Very similar. I mean, I would just say that we're obviously, we're willingly and not instrumentalized in the market, and I will say that the work that I did as the director of the Rose Art Museum before joining the BMA was substantially easier because, you know, rewinding 5 years, 10 years, the level of economic opportunity that was afforded by bias in art history was sort of staggering. So those, you know, a masterpiece by Norman Lewis was accessible at auction for less than $100,000, or even less than that. There was such a limited awareness of his impact, and I'm just using one example. You could apply it to Alma Thomas, you could apply it to Al Loving, these sort of new icons of American abstraction. So that economic opportunity has disappeared as a consequence of the work that museums have been doing in rewriting art history. So I feel sort of a deep pride in the fact that we were at the forefront of doing that work. But the consequence of it is that our research has restructured the market, has restructured private collectors' focus, and we can't buy the best work in that area anymore. In a lot of ways, that's great for the artists, it's great for the estates, and I'm happy for them. It just means that we need to sort of double down and find another story to write that creates more economic opportunity for us. And it's a cycle, obviously.
You mentioned private collectors, but I mean, in Dresden, Hilke, private collections have played quite an active role in relation with public collections too, have they not? Or the ways in which the museum has had access to?
Yeah, because of course after 89 it was quite difficult to fill the gaps that we had on Western art. And I think that's the reason why many private collectors like Erika Hoffmann or Egidio Mazzona gave their collections or their archives to the state art collections, yes. No, I think we have a quite distant relationship to private collectors, but in those two cases, I think it was really helping us a lot. As Erika Hoffmann, for example, she has in her collection, it's around 50% female women artists, so it's really bringing us a big step forwards. But at the same time, both collections are Western collections. So they started collecting at the Rhineland, and now they have some works of Eastern European artists, but to be honest, they are Western collections.
Interesting. Another aspect, I mean, maybe so you could begin on this one, is we've been talking largely through the lens of the contemporary, but I think you all in your different ways have talked about how then it is also important to look back. I mean, Tate's global push, if you could call it that, over 20 years, has not all been relentlessly contemporary, and various stages have led you back into the various areas into which you've expanded.
Yeah, I think the most sort of significant development for us was to look back modernisms. And this multiple modernisms as an idea is now quite a sort of a known way of presenting modern period, which is sort of more early 20th century art across the world. So when you look at the contemporary practice, obviously the sort of historic legacies come from the different cultures and traditions. And we realize that it's not all about these ideas of abstraction or Alfred Barr's model of this torpedo, like art narratives, which are very neat, too neat. And these more of entangled and complicated pictures come from modern period, and perhaps that can also go back further in the sort of chronological way as well. So I think it's very important to look at what was precursors to this contemporary practice and why certain practices from different geographical regions are what it is now, and just to look at different philosophical or traditional cultural contexts. I think it's very important to think about these contextualized legacies to practices, which aren't always just international or always just one particular type, what was once thought of as international style.
Yeah, interesting. Is that the way you look back, Chris? In your context?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think a really pressing and interesting conundrum for us is our American collection, which is a very strong one. So from literally the founding of the country, and then we have a sort of arbitrary cutoff at about 1943, and then it transitions to modern contemporary, and we could probably put pressure on those transitions, but irrespective. And we have an entire wing dedicated to this, which we have to reinstall. So the question is, how do we take that sort of meta-commitment of art and society and narrate the founding and development of a country through visual culture in a way that represents the values that we've embraced in the present? So I'm fortunately not the curator responsible for that. It's an enormous task, but in my mind's eye, I can see a social history told through material culture, enfolding craft traditions, native traditions, fine art traditions, and all media in sort of an unbounded fashion. That's the idea in my mind, and I think that sometimes natural history museums, more progressive ones, do a much better job of enlivening the object than we do. I think that tendency of lining up the paintings that are regularly spaced across a white wall, that cannot possibly be the beginning and the end of a curatorial practice. So we're using this American wing pilot program to reconceive what a permanent collection might look like.
And your collection, Hilke, I mean, it's very broad. It goes back to 1800 to Romanticism, and it currently is still structured or displayed, broadly speaking, chronologically. Is that right? With interventions, with
Yeah, it's quite classical. We're working on this since when I started. But there's a lot to do. And of course, referring to non-European artists or to colored artists, we have really nothing. So we just have an intervention by Kehinde Wiley in our portrait gallery. So and we try to have intervention in different spaces, but it's still very, very classical.
So where are we on this question of the grand narratives? I mean, if we are uprooting the grand narratives, what are we left with? Are we left with micro-histories? Are we left with personal histories, of lived experience? Are we left with local stories, localist stories? What are we left with? Or doesn't it matter? Or do we know?
Are we really supposed to answer?
You are.
I mean, is there a feeling that other route maps of necessity must come into existence or will come into existence? Or is
I
it
can
time
say
not
one
for
thing, maybe just to get the conversation started, as I mentioned, the American wing is a pilot program for reconceiving what a permanent collection presentation could look like. I would say that if I could assemble a group of 10 geniuses, click my fingers, and they transform the BMA, I would say that I would dissolve geographic lines, and I would tell a global history of art. So when you say that many modernisms have become a sort of common understanding, what would it mean to apply that many modernisms principle across a history of art to deliberately dissolve geographies and create conversations over continents structured by time? That I would love to see a museum do that.
And one effort is really about reconstruct different type of narratives. And I think it's the most important thing with the framework we are pushing, the transnational, is about non-hierarchical, multiple, and also horizontal kind of stories where no hierarchies are particularly prioritized, but it can be remapped constantly and in the context. So that is really not just about certain African art, Asian art, but what connected all these things and why they are historically but regionally always having some sort of context. Artists moved, and by voluntary ways, but also sometimes by force, and history, war, conflict, all these things result in migrations of ideas, but also people. And how do these flows change because of historical, social changes? And that's sort of the contact and point and constant remapping possibilities. That's what I'm really looking for.
And we're talking here about museums as agents of change, and your transnational research department is very much tasked with making its outcomes are for the museum. They have to inform acquisitions, they have to inform exhibitions. You're not just talking to the academic world. I mean, bubbling along here, I guess, all along, is between historical realities and the museum's positions, is where is, and maybe this will lead on to the afternoon's debate, where does that leave art history? Of what use to you are the art historians, the art history? Is it still fit for purpose? Is it changing with you? Are you changing it, or are you responding to directives which come from changing art history? I know that's a very big question, but I mean, are there ways of answering that?
I think art histories have changed, and we're not really the leader of all this different way of looking at art. And we want to contribute this reframing, which has been started with a lot of sort of academics leading the way, but also we are working with artists. I think that's the benefit of being a museum and museum curators. We really follow these artists whose practice really tells these different stories. Art historians are there to frame all these things and to make sense of these historical facts, making what sort of a point of history we see these things as a reflection of some sort. So working with artists as a museum curator, but also responding to art historical debate and discussions, I think that's where this museum's role really lies in.
I mean, I still think that art history as a discipline has extraordinary value, and I rely on that tendency towards close looking and research to structure new histories. And I think as long as the practitioner has the values of the present front of mind in the work that they're doing and is looking methodically back through history for untold stories or narratives that align with the more horizontal connected histories that we're writing, I still think that that discipline rooted in history and research is the methodology that we have to employ at our core. I just think that the translation of those findings has to be a little bit more inventive in the public space, that's all.
Okay, do you want to comment?
But I think we have always to start with the local narratives, and I think I in Dresden have no other chance than to do that, and then to show the other art histories that were existing at the same time. But of course my problem is, what can you do if your public or the folk does not want their canon to be rewritten? So this is my situation right now.
That sounds like a sort of cliffhanger in a way to maybe break. I don't know. I mean, we're going to go on talking later on after this afternoon's presentation. So maybe we should just freeze it there. Is that right? And thank you all three for really stimulating discussion. Really good.